Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Dungeon Encounters, a recent dungeon crawler by Square Enix, which continues their fairly recent trend of naming things in an incredibly unimaginative, bland, and in some cases, like say Triangle Strategy, downright stupid manner. But no, don't worry, I'm gonna ramble about the stupid naming of Triangle Strategy whenever I get around to doing a video on that game. As for Dungeon Encounters, at least it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't really go out of their way to name this thing anything all that interesting, because frankly, there's barely anything to this game at all, and the name Dungeon Encounters basically sums up exactly what it is. Square Enix describes it as a unique dungeon exploration RPG, which is a bit of a mess. I mean, yeah, it is dungeon exploration. It's certainly not an RPG, not in the slightest. There is literally no role-playing in this game whatsoever, and even describing it as a JRPG would be extremely generous, because describing it as a JRPG would imply that there is a set cast of characters and you are going through a set storyline, which this game doesn't have. You may be looking at this and saying, but DW, I can clearly see that you have a party full of characters, and no, I don't have a party full of characters. What I have is a party full of portraits with names and stats attached to them. There is no dialogue in this game whatsoever. There is no story in this game whatsoever. You are going around a dungeon, moving along a series of tiles, and when you get to one that has a number on it, then something happens. Either you find something like, say, a resurrection shrine or something like that, or you will have an encounter against a group of enemies, at which point it will go into a very simplistic battle interface where you have a turn-based battle system that uses the active time mechanics that you saw in some of the older Final Fantasy games and Chrono Trigger. And for those of you who don't know what the active time battle system is, it's basically the standard Final Fantasy combat system, where you have the generic JRPG-style turn-based combat where your party stands in a line, and the enemy party stands in a line, and then you just take turns whacking each other repeatedly or casting spells or whatever until eventually one side or the other wins. The main twist that the active time part of that brings is that instead of it being the player's turn and then the enemy's turn, all of the enemies and all of the party members each have timers that need to complete in order for them to be able to take an action. So it basically just takes the standard generic JRPG combat system and makes it asynchronous turns instead of structured turns. And let me put it this way, I don't like the standard generic JRPG combat system. I never have. I will put up with it for some of the really old games in the genre, like say the early Dragon Quest titles or the very early Final Fantasies, or something along those lines, because back in the 80s when these games were developed, most of them were made for the likes of the NES or the Famicom, and that meant that they were dealing with extremely limited hardware capabilities, and they were also dealing with some very limited storage space, so there was only so much they could really do with that. That all changes once you get to the era of the SNES and Super Famicom and the Genesis and Mega Drive. The hardware was much more capable, and simply slapping better graphics on the same old generic boring as hell combat was just not gonna cut it. So you started to see more games experimenting with different combat systems. Some would take it more real-time, like the Tales series for example, and some would take it in a more strategic or tactical direction, like say Shining Force or Fire Emblem. Meanwhile, Squaresoft's Galaxy Brain idea was to take the extremely bland, boring as hell combat from JRPGs of yore and just slap a bunch of timers on it, so you have to wait even more than you already had to wait. Now, proponents of the system will probably tell you things like it's so strategic and you have to time things well, but that's not really what's happening. What's really happening is it just introduces even more waiting into an already very sluggish, very tedious, extremely boring combat system. And they stuck with this for 25 years. It wasn't until Final Fantasy XV that they finally ditched the active time battle system in favor of an action-oriented combat system that was in real time. And between when they first introduced that with Final Fantasy IV back in 1991 and when they finally ditched it, they only made some pretty minimal changes to it. And by the time you hit the PS1 era, about the only thing they were really doing with it from then on out was changing the interface for it and throwing in tons of completely over-the-top cutscene style animations for whenever somebody does so much as cast a fireball. Because clearly the best way to improve an extremely slow, tedious, and drawn-out combat system is to make it even slower, even more tedious, and even more drawn out. Now, on the positive side, Dungeon Encounters doesn't force you to sit through constant animations. It's actually a relatively snappy implementation of the combat system, but it's only snappy because you only have some portraits and some stat numbers being displayed, and then you're mostly just watching the timers complete. And about the only relevant things that you're going to be paying attention to as you wander around the dungeon and fight stuff are how much physical defense or magical defense an enemy has, and whichever it has less of, you're going to focus attacks on it based on that. So if it's an enemy with higher physical defense, then you're going to focus on magical attacks against it. If it's an enemy with higher magical defense, you're going to focus on physical attacks against it. And once you've knocked its physical or magical defense down to 0, you will finally be able to start doing health damage against it, and once of course you've bottomed out its health, then that enemy is defeated entirely. There is basically no strategy to any of this combat. You just wait for the timer to complete, you select the attack that it's going to be weaker against, and then you just smack it upside the head until eventually you win. And eventually you'll start running into enemies and encounters that are tailor-made to piss you off. Enemies that will steal a ludicrous amount of gold from you when they hit you, and they can hit you enough that you'll be put into so much debt that you will have to spend dozens of hours grinding to get it all back. Enemies that will destroy your equipment. Situations where your party can be petrified or can be dispersed around the labyrinth, and thus you'll have to send in another party of adventurers to go find them, thus requiring you to delve all the way through the entire labyrinth that you've already explored using this new party, which you're going to have to grind through to get them up to the appropriate level and the appropriate equipment to be able to take on the encounters where the other party had gotten to. And if you choose to mess with dungeon encounters, you will be doing this for 99 dungeon floors, all of which are just tile layouts, and you have to walk on them to explore them, and eventually they will get you AP, which will then allow you to slot new abilities in your party abilities list. And while the idea of exploration equals progress is certainly interesting, you have no reason to care. Since there's no plot, you have no real attachment to why you're going into the dungeon in the first place. You have absolutely no attachment to any of the characters, because they're just portraits with names attached to them, and they have a bunch of stats that you can't do anything with because all level ups are automatic, and the only thing that really differentiates them is what things they have equipped at any given moment. You have no reason to care about the dungeon itself because as you're wandering around and exploring it, it's just a series of tiles to you. You have no lore to find, there's no ancient secrets to uncover, not really very many puzzles to solve either, and so there's no real feeling of actually exploring anything or going on an adventure or anything like that. And when it comes to the combat, the only reason you could possibly care about that is if you already like the active time battle system, and even then, it is an extremely bare-bones implementation of active time battle. So even though it's faster than pretty much any of the other versions of active time battle I've ever encountered, it's also the most lifeless implementation of it I've ever seen. Because you know what? At least Final Fantasy VI has Sabin suplexing a train. At least Chrono Trigger has the writing to fall back on. Dungeon Encounters, on the other hand, is minimalist to a fault. It's almost like it's a prototype that they just threw out on the market just to see what would happen, and they charged $30 for it. That's an absurd price for what you're getting. I mean, hell, it doesn't even have good music. The music in this game, if you can even call it that, is just awful, discordant noise that assaults your senses. So do yourself a favor. If you were looking into Dungeon Encounters and thinking, that's different and maybe interesting, don't bother picking it up. And while I don't really have enough experience with JRPG-style dungeon crawlers to really be able to recommend all that many of them if you're looking for alternatives, I can at least point you in the direction of some of the JRPG style of dungeon crawlers that I do have some experience with, like the Etrian Odyssey series, which has the added benefit of being able to map out the dungeon on the touchpad. In fact, that's one of the more interesting features of that series. course, some of you may not really be all that interested in DS or 3DS games, so if that's not really your thing, then maybe you might want to look into something like Wizardry Labyrinth of Lost Souls, or the indie game Infinite Adventures, both of which are more traditional first-person style JRPG dungeon crawlers, which Etrian Odyssey actually is as well, but it has the mapping feature. And both Infinite Adventures and Labyrinth of Lost Souls are half the price of dungeon encounters. Although I would caution you in the case of Labyrinth of Lost Souls that it is punishingly difficult, and I've barely made it more than a few minutes into the game, so something to keep in mind. And of course, if you're looking for just dungeon crawlers in general and don't really care whether it's JRPG style or more Western style, then look into something like Legend of Grimrock 1 and 2, look into the classic Eye of the Beholder games, maybe even something a bit out there like Stonekeep or Anvil of Dawn or something like that. All of those are going to ultimately be far more satisfying to you in the long run than dungeon encounters could ever hope to be. Thanks for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.